We have now discussed the three most important systems of logic that are used in philosophy, namely propositional logic, predicate logic, and modal logic. And as you can imagine, there's also a wide variety of other, even more exotic logics that allow us to study arguments with even other argument structures. However, what I want to do now is not go into these other logics, but take a step back and ask some very fundamental questions. Namely, I want to ask two questions. First of all, do we actually need logic, and why do we need it? And with we, I mean here we as philosophers, but also we as human beings in general. And then the second question I would like to ask is, well, if we need logic at all, does it have to be formal logic? Why does it have to be formal? Can't we just make do with some informal kind of logic so that we don't have to bother with all these mathematical symbols? And the answer I would like to give is that yes, we do need logic, and yes, it has to be formal. Okay, a sad truth for some of you perhaps, but I think I can give a very good argument for it. Okay, so let's first turn to the first question, namely, do we actually need logic? And here, I think the answer has to do with a very basic fact of human psychology. So what I would like to do now is describe a certain experiment that has been carried out by psychologists about the human capacity to assess deductive validity. Okay. So what these psychologists have done, they have gathered some people in a room, some participants to the experiment, and they have given them lots of arguments and asked them, tell me which of these arguments you think to be deductively valid and which of them you think to be deductively invalid. Okay? And there's lots of arguments, but basically they came in four types. Why four? Well, as you will remember from the introductory lecture, on the one hand, there's the notion of deductive validity, which had to do with conditional truth. The conclusion has to be true given the premises. So that already yields two possibilities, valid versus invalid. But then secondly, there's also the distinction, is the conclusion actually true? Okay? Or is it false? Or in softer terms, is the conclusion plausible or implausible? Is it believable? It makes sense. Or it's unbelievable, doesn't make any sense. Okay? And these two questions are basically independent of each other. On the one hand, valid versus invalid. On the other, believable versus unbelievable conclusion. What it means to say that these are independent is that we get exactly four types of arguments. We get valid arguments with a believable conclusion, valid arguments with an unbelievable conclusion. We get invalid arguments with a believable conclusion, and invalid arguments with an unbelievable conclusion. Okay? So let's have a look at some of the examples, some of the arguments that were given to the participants in this study. So I'm not going to read all of them, but you can see, for example, that if you look at the valid argument with the believable conclusion, then the believable conclusion is some highly trained dogs are not police dogs. That's a sentence that makes sense. It's true, it seems plausible. I have a dog of my own. When he's in a good day, I like to think that he's highly trained, but he's definitely not a police dog. If we now look at an invalid argument with an unbelievable conclusion, then we see the sentence, some millionaires are not rich people. Okay? And now, of course, you might say, well, it all depends on the context. What do you mean with rich? But in general, we have the feeling that millionaires are rich people, so this conclusion is false. So lots of arguments are presented to these participants in the experiment. And what you would expect is, if these people are really good at recognizing deductive validity, then you would expect to get the most hits, the most yeses, in the top two cells of the table. Because you can see that these are exactly the cells that contain the arguments that are, as a matter of fact, deductively valid. Okay? As you can see, they are instances of the argument form no A are B, some C are B, so some C are not A, which is deductively valid. So what you would expect is lots of hits there. Unfortunately, this is not what these psychologists observed. What they observed rather was very many hits, not in the top two cells, but rather in the leftmost two cells. So in the cells where we had arguments with believable conclusions. So what was going on was that even though these people claimed to be assessing deductive validity of arguments, what they were actually doing was they were assessing the truth, or at least the plausibility, the believability of the conclusion. So we need logic because we have to stop people from looking at the believability of the conclusion rather than the conditional truth of the conclusion given the premises. So what's going on here? Well, I think that it's fair to say that all humans have, somewhere deep down inside, the capacity to judge, to assess deductive validity of arguments. However, what happens is that very often this capacity is being clouded by something called belief bias or confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency that people have to prefer true statements, believable statements, statements that make sense, statements such as some highly trained dogs are not police dogs. So even if an argument is invalid, as long as its conclusion is believable, our belief bias, our confirmation bias will take over and will lead us astray and will lead us to say that this argument is deductively valid. Incorrectly, of course. So we need basically logic, because logic is exactly what helps us to block the pernicious effects of this confirmation bias on our ability to assess deductive validity of arguments. So that's the first question. Second question is, why does logic have to be formal? Why does it have to be symbolic? And here I think the answer lies exactly in the line of what I've been talking about before, namely, if logic is symbolic, then it will do a very good job at helping to block the pernicious effects of this confirmation bias. And why is that? Well, I would now like to describe a second psychological experiment. And this experiment, in this experiment, the psychologists ask their participants to imagine a story. It's a story about a very faraway planet in another galaxy where there are aliens. You have never been there before. I'm just now telling you for the first time. You don't know anything about these aliens, but they happen to have a very difficult, very complex social structure with lots of different castes, lots of different social classes, family relationships, etc., etc. And then again, the people in this experiment are asked to assess the deductive validity of arguments. Not just arguments about rich people and millionaires or police dogs, but arguments involving terms describing this alien species. So for example, here's a typical argument that would be given to the participants of this experiment. All animals of the hood-on class are ferocious. All wampets are ferocious. Therefore, conclusion, all wampets are animals of the hood-on class. Now, if you don't know what words such as hood-on class and wampet mean, that's perfectly okay, of course. They are not words of English. They are just words that are made up by the psychologist to describe this imaginary alien species, okay? Now, what happens is, when you ask people to assess deductive validity of arguments and you give them arguments like this, is that all of a sudden they do a much better job. They do recognize the deductively valid arguments, and they are able to separate them from those that are deductively invalid. And what is going on here is, well, we already have this capacity to recognize deductively valid arguments, but typically it's being clouded by our confirmation bias, by our tendency to prefer believable conclusions. Now here, there is no such thing as a believable conclusion. There is no such thing as an unbelievable conclusion. Conclusion here is not about things that we know about, such as rich people or millionaires. No, it's about these things that we have never heard of before, such as wampets, the hood-on class. So we have no idea what this argument is about. Our confirmation bias simply doesn't kick in. It doesn't have any bad influence, so our capacity to assess deductive validity can do its job, and we will get much better results. This is a process that is called in psychology desemantification. Semantics has to do with the meaning of words, with what we know about certain words. For example, we know what it means to be rich, what it means to be a millionaire, etc. Now, when you look at words such as wampet or hood-on class, these words are effectively meaningless. They don't have any meaning. I just introduced them to you for the first time a couple of minutes ago. So they have been desemantified, so to speak. They have no semantics. So the idea is that as soon as you take semantics away, people's ability to recognize deductive validity goes up. Now, there's various ways in which you can take the semantics of the words away. One possible way to do this is by, like the psychologists do, by coming up with a strange story about alien species and by invoking made-up words of English such as wampus or hoedonklas. But another, probably even more effective way of achieving desementification is by not looking at a word such as human or mortal, but simply by looking at symbols, letters such as H and M. So when you are making an exercise, for example, in first-order logic, you probably think of the H that you are writing as standing for human, but it would probably be better if you didn't. That you simply rely on the symbols that are there, that you do not get led astray by the meaning that are behind these symbols. So in summary, we do need logic because it helps us to avoid the pernicious effects of confirmation bias, and this logic has to be symbolic because that's the most effective way in which we can do that.